somewhat better story for you. I'm a political scientist, so my focus will be on the political part of the political economy of BC's carbon tax, which in many respects is a textbook example of a carbon tax. It was introduced in 2008 at a $10 per ton of CO2 tax with a schedule initially for the next 4 years of increase of $5 per ton to the 2012, at which point the tax would reach $30 per ton. It was applied evenly to all combustion sources of all fossil fuels, as well as peat and used tires. And that covered 77% of British Columbia's emissions. It excluded process emissions from things like cement manufacturing and fugitive emissions from natural gas production and waste disposal. There was a low income tax credit built into the tax, and it is revenue neutral, with the revenue being recycled through a combination of reductions in personal income taxes at the two lowest brackets, reductions in corporate income tax and the small business tax. And that commitment to revenue neutrality was backed up by a legal requirement that it be achieved, otherwise the finance minister's salary is dinged by 15%. So we've actually more than achieved revenue neutrality. We have a revenue neutral carbon tax, I think, because of that. 4 questions that I'd like to address in the next few minutes. How was it that BC adopted a carbon tax? How did it survive the political backlash, which did indeed emerge? What are the long-term prospects for the tax in BC, and what do we know about whether it's working or not? So first off, why a carbon tax? As a political scientist, I find that quite puzzling, because at the time BC adopted its carbon tax, it was really going against the grain. Emissions trading had already been adopted in Europe. There was a call for national cap-and-trade programs in Canada and the U.S., regional programs among U.S. states and Canadian provinces, and some reasons why a carbon tax would be politically more difficult. It's got that T word in it, which alienates voters, and also it doesn't have the ease, the sort of invisibility of transferring free permits to large industrial emitters. So I've identified a number of reasons why I think the timing was just right in British Columbia. First off, BC has the possibility of taking advantage of untapped hydroelectricity potential. I think that can be overstated because transportation emissions are a relatively large part of BC's inventory, but it still does make it easier. Secondly, we've experienced in Canada, even more so than in the U.S., cyclical public attention to the environment, and in particular climate change. And one of the peaks in public attention to climate change occurred from mid-2006 to early 2008. So this was a time when there was greater public support for measures, and that's consistent with BC adopting a number of different climate policies in 2007. That then prompted environmental groups, and interestingly, 70 or 75 academic economists to write a letter calling for adoption of a provincial carbon tax in late 2007. I don't think this accounts, I mean, I think it helped create conditions politically, but it doesn't explain the adoption of a carbon tax, because already public opinion, public attention was starting to trail off by early 2008. And also, even when the public's paying attention, they're not calling for a tax. A third factor I think that was important is that the tax was adopted by the party that was right of center in BC politics, the Liberal Party. And that was important in 2 respects. First, there was this appeal, given public attention, that they may be able to win over centrist votes by adopting greener policies. And the premier at the time, Gordon Campbell, was quite influenced by the example of Arnold Schwarzenegger in California, and had regular meetings with him, talked to him on the phone, and in fact built a number of California policies into the package that was announced in British Columbia in 2007, although obviously a carbon tax went beyond that. The second aspect of the right of center government that was important, I think, is that the business community cut them slack. So in late 2007, when there started to be trial balloons floated about the possibility of a carbon tax, the business community was silent. In fact, the government had consulted with business leaders who told them that they would be okay with it. They would accept a carbon tax on two conditions. The first being that it covered the whole economy, not just industry. And that was particularly important because with very heavy reliance, 90% of BC's electricity comes from hydro. The industrial sector accounts for a smaller fraction of BC's emissions, and they didn't want to have to carry the bag for the quite demanding targets that had just been adopted. And secondly, the business community insisted on revenue neutrality, both of which were built into the tax. And finally, because it's still not the case that the business sector was asking for a carbon tax, it came down to the influence of one person. This wasn't his idea, but the premier at the time was in a position to follow through on his commitment to adopting a carbon tax. And I picked a picture of Gordon Campbell with his thumbs up because he's very fond of putting his thumbs up whenever he talked about the BC carbon tax. Now, political institutions made a difference because in Canada's Westminster system, combining single-member plurality electoral system with a parliamentary system, Mr. Campbell controlled a significant majority of the seats in the legislature, and there's a tradition of very strong command of the party by leaders in Canadian politics. So he was able to push through this policy and back it up despite rebellion within his own caucus. Well, rebellion would be a bit strong, but unease, to say the least. The decision was made between elections. The Liberals didn't run for election on a call for carbon tax, as their federal counterparts did later in the year and crashed and burned. Rather unfortunately. There is a question of why the premier cared so much about this. I think there's lots of possibilities. He's emphasized a trip to China, very policy wonkish guy who took all kinds of books on climate change off on his Christmas vacations in 2007 and 2008. Started talking about the future a lot more when he had grandchildren. But the key thing is that he had the institutional wherewithal to push through a policy that he was personally very committed to. How did it survive? There was indeed, as had been expected, a significant backlash, although from kind of surprising quarters. The backlash first emerged from northern rural communities that perceived that the tax was unfair to them for two reasons. It's colder. And secondly, they tend to drive pickup trucks. This was, in fact, incorrect because people living in colder places had better insulated houses. And also, they don't drive their pickup trucks very far because they live in small towns. So they actually were paying least under the carbon tax, but that didn't matter because there was this perception that really resonated with a long-standing theme in British Columbia politics, that the rural communities were paying the price for the lifestyle in the urban Lower Mainland. So that emerged, and local governments started passing resolutions opposing the tax, saying they weren't going to send in money. The opposition party, the New Democratic Party, opportunistically picked up on that. This was a surprise because just a few months before, the NDP had called for a carbon tax. But they changed their mind and launched an Axe the Tax campaign in which they talked about how their policy, which was a cap-and-trade proposal, unlike the carbon tax, would make big polluters pay. At the same time, and with just astoundingly bad timing, there was a dramatic increase in the price of gasoline in the first half of 2008. So the policy was announced in February, and it took effect in July just as the price of gasoline peaked at about 40% higher. And the tax pushed the price over $1.50 a liter in Vancouver gas stations. And I think it was widely reported that this was because of the carbon tax rather than completely different forces. At that point, the tax was 2 cents. So that really hurt the political popularity. And it's also, polling showed that 75% of people believed that they were losers under the tax because people were very aware of the increase in price and in fact exaggerated the increase in price on energy, but were not paying any attention or didn't trust the corresponding tax deductions. And if anything, because most people perceived that the way the tax would work was by government collecting the money and spending it on good things, the idea that it was revenue neutral was perceived as somehow sleight of hand. They're just being tricky with us. There was a quite significant drop in public support from majority support when the tax was first introduced to majority opposition on the day that it took effect, and the governing party's popularity also nosedived over this period. But it was saved by the recession. So this figure shows a number of lines. The question that was asked by pollsters, what is the most important problem facing British Columbia? And this is the percent of people who indicated as their top most important problem: healthcare, environment, gasoline prices, and the economy. And you can see that the environment, the green line, was actually number 2 at the time the policy was adopted, unlike in other provinces. So BC was actually a province where people were less concerned about the environment than elsewhere. But it was starting to decline already by February 2008 when it was adopted. You can see the brown line that peaks up. That's concern about the price of energy. So that's the peak in gasoline prices. The policy took effect right at the top of that peak, unfortunately, and became more unpopular as a result. But then here comes the red line, sort of to the rescue. To the rescue in the sense that as the global recession took effect and the public's priorities shifted from the environment and health care to the economy, they returned to the Liberal fold. And in fact, on the question of which party do you trust to manage the economy, the Liberals had a 30-point lead. So in the May 2009 election, Premier Campbell didn't talk about his carbon tax. He talked about the economy, the economy, the economy, and voters returned home. He won another majority. Interestingly, he didn't talk about the carbon tax on the election, the campaign trail, but some of the first words out of his mouth in his victory speech, which is pictured here, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, were, we showed that it could be done and our carbon tax will survive. Long-term prospects, by 2012, the last of the tax increases had taken effect, and BC was increasingly isolated. The expected national cap-and-trade programs had not materialized. In response, most states and provinces had withdrawn from the Western Climate Initiative, and also the tax was 3 times higher at that point, $30 per ton rather than $10 per ton initially. Many voices within the business community were increasingly concerned about impacts on competitiveness, and the Premier, who had pushed through this policy against reservations of many of his own party members, was gone and had been replaced by a new Premier who announced a review of BC's carbon tax. But the other thing that had happened, one of the other things that had happened in the meantime, is that public support for the tax had rebounded. Now, I think that support is still pretty soft, but still it is back up higher than it was initially, with almost a 2-for-1 level of support to opposition as of the middle of 2012. With that decline in, I think, attention to the tax, public support had rebounded. The business community, many of which had called for getting rid of the tax, when push came to shove and the review took place, instead called for a freeze on the level of the tax. And I think the reason for that is the next point, which is that the government needed the revenue. The tax accounts only for about 3% of government revenue, but with a commitment to a balanced budget, if the tax was cut, the provincial government would have to increase taxes somewhere else. And the small business community, which was most concerned, was actually the greatest relative beneficiary of those tax cuts. The policy ended up being kept, frozen for the next 5 years at $30 per ton unless our trading partners catch up. There have been some minor but worrying concessions that have been made over time. Worrying in the sense either that it's not clear what the justification is or that they were badly designed, so that they're basically getting rid of the impact of the tax rather than returning lump sum revenues to northern communities, local governments, the agriculture sector. The big challenge for British Columbia is going to be plans to develop an export-oriented LNG industry. Ironically, BC's sometimes largest export is coal, but we don't burn our own coal. So we've got this we've had a relatively steady source of tax revenues from the fossil fuel industry that hasn't contributed to domestic emissions. That's not going to be the case with natural gas from fracking, where there will be significant emissions both at the point of production, but also liquefaction of that resource for export by burning the natural gas. And I think that's going to be the real political challenge for survival of the tax. And I anticipate that the provincial government will waive application of the tax to the combustion emissions from any LNG plant. What do we know about whether it's working? There are starting to be a few studies emerging that take advantage of both variation over time, but also across Canadian provinces with consistent data. This figure from a publication by LG and Maclay shows that although both the other 9 provinces in Canada and British Columbia started to experience a reduction in gasoline purchases with the recession, that's turned around in the rest of Canada but has continued to decline in British Columbia. Of course, there may be other things going on there, but I think an important paper by Rivers and Schauffele, which is under review, finds that, in fact, at a $25 per ton carbon tax, the decline in gasoline purchases in British Columbia was actually 7 times greater than they would have expected just based on the price impact alone. Now, they attribute that to the salience of the tax. I don't know whether that's the political controversy or whether it was the fact that people knew that the price was going to continue to increase. In either case, freezing the tax now and the decline in public attention to it may be undermining that to some degree. There was a second paper by the same authors that's now forthcoming that looked at the impact on competitiveness, focusing on the agriculture sector because that's the one that had gotten a waiver from the tax, and they find no justification for that waiver. And finally, I just read this morning, a new paper that looks at the incidence of the BC carbon tax and finds that it has been progressive both before and after revenue recycling. I can tell you more as much as I retained over breakfast from reading that paper today. So in summary, I think the good news about the BC carbon tax is that it demonstrates that there are opportunities for political leadership. A combination of different factors, cyclical public attention, so striking while the iron is hot. I think it tends to be easier in parliamentary systems, including Westminster systems like BC's, but also those with proportional representation where small green parties have often been very influential in adoption of carbon pricing. I think it may be there's a Nixon goes to China element to the BC carbon tax that made it possible to adopt it without uproar from the business community because it was a right of center government. The one surprise for me as a political scientist is the degree to which the carbon tax has been politically stable once it's established. It was very difficult to get in the first place, but once it's there, even though it's revenue neutral, getting rid of it would require alienating all over again, alienating taxpayers in the business community by increasing some other tax rate as they've stopped paying attention to the carbon tax. Finally, definitely the story about the initial reaction to the BC carbon tax is not a happy one. There was all kinds of misunderstanding and opportunistic capitalization on that politically. The big question for me is if we can share these kinds of experiences over time, whether the backlash will be reduced in subsequent jurisdictions. There's currently negotiations going on, renewed between Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and California. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. Thank you.